Anderson. We now have a wonderful opportunity to hear a live presentation from Reverend Anderson on God and the church's work for racial equality and justice. Following this presentation, we hope to have some time for questions and responses. So I'll ask Reverend Anderson to please raise her hand in the participants window, and I ask everyone else to please keep yourself muted during her entire presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I am going to attempt to share my screen and pray that technology cooperates with me. Will you pray with me about that? Okay, we're almost there. Come on. Fantastic. Good morning, Presbytery of New Hope. I want to give thanks to God for you and for extending this invitation to me to speak with you today. And just a word of caution, I'm having a little, well, actually a lot of hand pain. I ruptured something in there and I have to get surgery on it on Tuesday. Your prayers are coveted, but if my face does some weird things, especially as you're talking to me, it's not you, it's me. I'm just in a little bit of discomfort, but we'll get through this together. I serve as the coordinator for racial and intercultural justice in Louisville, Kentucky, and I come to you today from Louisville, Kentucky, which is land that was originally inhabited and stewarded by the Osage, Adena, Hopewell, Chickasaw, and Shawnee peoples. I am a teaching elder, minister of word and sacrament, minister member of National Capital Presbytery, which is the Washington, D.C. area. I am here to talk today about our Matthew 25 invitation from the PMA, Presbyterian Mission Agency, as it pertains to racism. And this really is designed to be a conversation. So I'll share some information and then we'll open it up for discussion if we have time. And I'm going to try to monitor my time very carefully. I want to do an examination of scripture that would hopefully engender that conversation. So I'm going to ask at some point, at various points, in our time together, if you would utilize the chat feature to answer some questions, just so I know that you're with me and you're paying attention and we're all thinking about this together. So first and foremost, the Matthew 25 invitation focuses on the last section, verses 31 through 46 of the 25th chapter of Matthew, which we believe calls us to actively engage in the world around us so that our faith comes alive and we wake up to new possibilities. You can tell I've said that so many times at this point. So it is this passage in both actions that took place at the 222nd General Assembly, which I co-moderated, and the 223rd General Assemblies. We were moved into action by this invitation to act boldly and compassionately to serve people who are hungry, oppressed, imprisoned, or poor. And so we've been extending this Matthew 25 invitation to presbyteries, to congregations, to synods, to help the denomination as a whole become a more relevant presence in the world. And it is in our recognition of God's and Jesus's urgent call to be a church of action that we do this. And we rejoice how our re-energized faith can unite all of us for a common and holy purpose, our common identity to do mission. And so we focus on three areas for the Matthew 25 invitation, one of which I'll be speaking more in depth. And those three areas are building congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, and eradicating systemic poverty. And so we understand that racism is not primarily about individual prejudices, right? Or individual beliefs or attitudes. It's a socially constructed system. One of the things that I try to do in my own work is to get us to think about racism in those terms. It's not about just being a nice person. It is about examining the whole of our lives together in all of our structures so that they are just and that they are inclusive of all people. Some of us are disadvantaged and others of us are advantaged just because of skin color or ethnic identity or ancestral background. Social power and prejudice have combined to treat people differently, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I was so grateful for the liturgy that talked about that in the prayer of confession. Excuse me. Some of us are privileged while others of us are oppressed. And as a consequence, there is unequal and inequitable access to resources like money, like education, like information, like decision-making power, like healthcare, as we've seen in this last year in the midst of this pandemic. And so what I find that a lot of Presbyterians don't know, but I know New Harmony knows because it was part of the 21-day racial justice challenge that you undertook this past month or so, is that the PCUSA has long been served by an anti-racism policy. Now, this policy was first accepted in 1999 and was last revised in 2016, and it's called Facing Racism, a Vision of the Intercultural Community. And I've chosen some excerpts that I find to be really poignant for our time together. And our policy states that while we each bear the indelible stamp of God's image, we recognize ourselves as fallen creatures who relate to others personally, socially, and institutionally in ways that deny that image in each other, and thereby violate the sacred bonds of community established by God. Sin and its effects continue to have consequences for relationships in the human community. The Reformed tradition affirms that sin, resulting in distorted relationships and broken covenantal agreements, operates in corporate structures as well as interpersonal relationships. And so when we're talking about racism, particularly when we as church folks, as Christians, talk about racism, we need to understand it spiritually. It is sin. John Calvin talks about what the Dutch Reformed Church names as total depravity. And it is the acknowledgement that even the best parts of us, even our best intentions, still are susceptible to the influence of sin. And sin is not limited to what we do as individuals. It is how we shape our lives corporately. So when we're talking about dismantling racism, we have to look again at the whole of our lives together and far beyond just who we are in private and public as individuals. So we often understand, or many of us understand, racism to be an issue of individual prejudice and interpersonal relationships, how one individual treats another. And certainly that plays a part in it. Individual prejudice plays a part in it. But I want to break down what we mean by institutional racism, systemic racism, and structural racism. So individuals together create institutions. An example of institution might be, I'm just naming something like Central High School. I feel like there's a Central High School in every state here. So Central High School is an institution. It is a school. Other examples of institutions would be your own congregations, right? And so institutional racism is how we do life together in ways that disproportionately impact people who are not racialized as white. So an example of institutional racism in a Central High School, for instance, might be the fact that Black and brown kids who go to that school are disciplined at higher rates than their white counterparts, for instance, even as they're not necessarily infringing or creating infractions among themselves at higher rates. They're simply disciplined at higher rates. That would be an example of institutional racism. All institutions come together to create systems. All of our institutions, more or less, are part of larger systems. So individuals are part of institutions. Institutions are a part of systems. Central High School is a part of the school system, wherever Central High School is located. And the structures within the school system might reinforce or inform the policies of the institution it's a part of. So again, that policy for discipline might not even originate at Central High School. It might originate with the school system, and it still serves the purpose or has the result of disproportionately impacting people of color, people who are not racialized as white. So other examples of systems would be the healthcare system, right? It would be the legal system. I have a lawyer friend who's also a minister who is very intentional about referring to our legal system as the legal system and not the justice system, because not all of what is legal is just, is what she maintains. So these are examples of systemic racism. So systems can create larger structures. Systems are themselves structures. They are structured a certain way, but different systems together can create larger structures. So an example of that would be the legal system and the educational system coming together to form what we call the school to prison pipeline. It is when we operationalize criminal justice in our schools. We have school resource officers who are there to handle disciplinary matters between students from a criminal justice perspective, which it may not even need to escalate to that, but there they are, ready and willing to intervene in a disciplinary action in such a way that brings children into the legal system. And there is myriad documentation on how the school to prison pipeline works, and how students who find themselves in that funneling system from the education system into the criminal justice system, into the legal system, have a very hard time ever finding their way back. And so it serves to create a lifetime of criminality, whereby these folks never really have the opportunity to enter into a larger society. So when we're talking about institutional, systemic, and structural problems, this is what we mean. So scripturally, I am a minister, and everything that I do and teach and believe and work for is undergirded by scripture. And I maintain once again that this really is not about our intentions, it is about our impact. Every part of us, the best parts of us, are in fact influenced from time to time by sinfulness, and we need to be able to interrogate that without crumbling, so to speak, or thinking that we are being cast as the ogres of the world. The Bible constantly reminds us that there is, Romans 3:10, as it is written, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. Later on in that chapter, since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Proverbs 12:14, there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way to death. Ecclesiastes, which is such a sunshiny book, talks about, surely there is no one on earth so righteous as to do good without ever sinning. And my personal favorite would be 1 John 1:8, which says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So when we're talking about the unintentional ways that we perpetuate racism, or we promulgate racism, we have to understand the role of implicit bias in this, which refers to attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And implicit biases can be, quote unquote, favorable or unfavorable, and they're activated involuntarily and often without our awareness or our intentional control, because they reside very deep in our subconscious. These biases are different from known biases that we may choose to conceal for the purposes of social and or political correctness. An example of that would be someone who really knows that they are racist, and yet they don't want to be seen as unfashionable. And so they might conceal and maybe enact their racism in more covert but still intentional ways. Implicit biases, however, and I'm talking about good folks here, are not accessible through introspection. We are all harboring implicit associations, and they develop over the course of our lifetime. And these are all associations that we make to things like race, to gender, to age, to nationality. It's our early life experiences, the things that we're taught, all of these things come together to create and inform the implicit associations that we have. News media and programming are very influential in informing our implicit associations too. So these biases that we have are pervasive. We all have them. Even those of us who make commitments to be impartial in our work and our relationships, we still have implicit biases. Implicit and explicit biases, those things that we expressly state rather than those things that we are just part of our psyche. They're related, but they're distinct. They're not mutually exclusive. They sometimes might even reinforce each other. And the implicit associations that we hold don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. I think that everybody, well, I hope that everyone in the church would express the belief that God has created us all equally. And yet our implicit associations might see us not treating all people equally, treating whom we declare as the other differently than we would someone who is in our own in-group. Okay, and our implicit associations can favor our in-group, and by in-group, I mean the groups that we are part of. So an in-group for me would be women. Another in-group for me would be Black people. Our implicit associations might favor our own in-group, or it might not. And they tend not to favor our in-group when our in-group is minoritized, when we're considered the other, when we're considered minorities, right? But they're malleable. They can change. Our brains are complex things, and we can gradually unlearn through a variety of debiasing techniques our implicit biases. Some of the tools that can help us do this, and I commend for you the implicit associations test that was developed at Harvard University, which is actually a cadre of tests. So you can assess your implicit associations with Black people, with Asian folks, with LGBTQIA people. You can test what your favorability, your implicit favorability or lack of favorability is with a number of identified groups. It's a really helpful group of tests. In partnership with the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University, which does a lot of work around implicit associations, MTV developed a 7-day bias cleanse, which is not too dissimilar from the 21-day racial challenge that you just underwent, and hopefully others of you will undergo after today. And a similar tool would be a complicity cleanse. From the Solidarity Gardens that examines our own complicity in systems of inequity and helps us to think through how we might break away from those more damaging behaviors, from our complicit behaviors. So when we're talking about Matthew 25 and race, however, we need to break down some things. First of all, race did not know it. Race as we understand it did not exist for the first century church or the Matthean community. Race is actually a pretty young concept in human history. It emerges maybe about half a century ago with the colonial project whereby you had European nations that were going in and colonizing nations of other folks. And a lot of that was reinforced and blessed and even instructed by the church. We understand from the work that the church has done and that others have done around the doctrine of discovery, the role that the church really had in catalyzing imperialism and colonialism. And so the doctrine of discovery said, in short, that Christian nations could go into nations that were not Christianized and help themselves to their resources, up to and including the people, right? And so eventually, though, as the missionary project makes its way alongside the doctrine of discovery, and serves to Christianize a lot of these nations that are also being colonized, you have to develop a sort of rationale for why you can continue to disabuse people of their land and their language and their resources. And so from that comes race and the categorization of people for the purpose of placing them in hierarchies, to say some people are here and other people are here. And much of how the church did that was through our own readings of the Bible, our own light and dark image in the Bible, which then translated to light skin and dark skin being evil or not. We, from this comes the proliferation of the idea of the curse of Cain. And the mark of Cain being dark skin, like that is indicative of the curse that Cain was placed under after he slew his brother Abel. You have the curse, the so-called curse of Ham. Ham being one of Noah's sons, whose descendants were said to have gone into the Middle East and the continent of Africa. And because Ham had uncovered his father's nakedness, he was cursed by Noah. And so those of us who descend from Africans are under the curse of Ham. These are all teachings that the church promulgated to reinforce the idea of race and human hierarchy. Now, what the Bible does say a lot about is poverty. Poverty being, just in short, we'll define it as a lack of capital. Now, we can talk about how and why that capital is lacking for a person, but poverty just simply is a lack of capital. Now, you have to understand race not as a biological reality, but a social construct. Again, race is formulated so that we place people into hierarchies. Some people are here and other people are here. So race actually functions as a form of capital. It's a form of currency. It is a form by which we trade wealth, okay? And so race concentrates capital among a certain group of people over that of others. So if we understand race as a form of capital and poverty is itself a lack of capital, then we have to address race as a means of keeping wealth and resources from our own siblings intentionally. Now, Matthew was written to a Northern Jewish Christian community that understood the Jewish social righteousness concept of tzedakah. Tzedakah, whenever we read it in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, is often translated as righteousness. It can also be translated as justice. Now, an example of tzedakah would be the command to harvest from your field, but leave what's surrounding on the outer edges of the field for the poor and the stranger. Tzedakah would be jubilee forgiving of debts, making sure that you take care of the widow and the orphan, basically the most vulnerable people among you. Make sure that they don't get too vulnerable. Make sure that you are taking them in and taking care of them. And if you do that, if you follow those commandments, then everybody's going to have what they need. All right. And so righteousness, dikaiosune, means joining justice and mercy in a way that's reminiscent of that Hebrew tzedakah. It's no more than simple justice for those who have the ability to care for those who have need through acts of mercy. This term appears with such frequency in Matthew's gospel that it is sometimes referred to as the gospel of justice. We see Matthew including the story of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus trying to figure out what he still lacks because he's done everything that his religion has told him to do. And Mark's gospel says that Jesus looks at him and loves him and says, you lack one thing. But he knows he's lacking something. And Jesus tells him, well, sell all you have and give the money to the poor and then come follow me. Which really is an invitation for this rich young man to ensure that everyone around him was taken care of. And the promise was that he would have treasure in heaven if he did that, but he goes away grieving and walks away from that vision, as it were. And so these constant examples of Matthew pushing people toward the kind of righteousness that made sure that everyone was okay and everyone was taken care of is deeply rooted in the audience to whom Matthew was written, which was a Jewish audience, which understood tzedakah, justice, righteousness, as how we are, how successful we are at being each other's people. And so at the 222nd General Assembly, I don't know how many of you are polity wonks and even care about the inner workings of the General Assembly. But in 2016, there were a number of overtures that were coming to the General Assembly that would really slow down how often the General Assembly undertook justice issues. It would have changed the rhythm of our General Assembly and the frequency with which we would be able to change our Constitution. And long story short, if those overtures had passed, we would not be able to deal with justice issues as an assembly until 2030. So there was a group of concerned Presbyterians who really did not want to see that we become that kind of church. And so they submitted their own overture through the Presbytery of Cascades out in the Oregon and Washington area. And the name of that overture was on choosing to be a church committed to the gospel of Matthew 25. And it recommended that the mission agency, through its Compassion, Peace, and Justice Ministries, implement a coordinated strategy or cycle of social engagement that will assure that concerns around confronting racism, environmental concerns, and standing against violence and militarism, and advocating for the dispossessed come before the assembly on a regular and consistent basis. So this is a piece of business that really pushes us to the work of justice and not away from it. And so they, and I'll be happy to share all of this with you. And even give you a link to the original item of business itself. But it took apart each section of Matthew 25, the first part of it being the parable of the 10 bridesmaids who, were going out to meet the bridegroom, and 5 of them didn't have enough, and the other 5 did have enough. And they wanted the 5 who had enough to share with them, and said, no, go out and buy your own oil. This is an eschatological vision, just basically saying, if you get ready, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready, right? And their rationale in response to that section was, Jesus tells a story about the church waiting for the moment moment of the Lord's arrival, some of those who are waiting are prepared when the time comes and some are not. The zeitgeist of our age, and remember this is 2016, is one of rapidly changing and endlessly creative activism exemplified by the Black Lives Matter movement. Let us be like the bridesmaids whose lamps are trimmed, ready to seize the moment. Now, the second section of Matthew 25's gospel is the parable of the man who has these slaves. He gives one slave 5 talents, another 3, and another 1. And you know, the one with 5 and 3 multiplies the number of talents, and the ruler says, "Well done. Enter into the favor of your master, the joy of your master." But the one who only was given 1 buried it. And the master was like, no, if you knew that I was harsh and you were scared to do anything, you could have at least put it in the bank. And I'm going to give away what I gave to you, and you're going to be banished. Leave me alone. And so when we read that part of Matthew 25, we often use the parallel of the master as representative of Jesus. Sometimes I ask people outright, who is the villain in this parable? But this group reads it entirely differently. And this is not an original or unusual reading of this text. They basically said Jesus tells a story about a bold slave who was punished for refusing to participate in the empire value of domination, because it's not like he stole from his master, right? So they go on to say, increasingly, we see brave individuals and groups calling out the powerful and standing against the rampant exploitation in our marketplaces, in our prisons, and on our streets. Let us resist evil like that slave and go stand on the margins of society in the outer darkness, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier about troubling the waters and getting into good trouble and not being afraid to be on the side of those who have been cast out, those who have been treated unfairly. And so the last parable is the judgment of the nations, where Jesus says, you know, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. And everyone is saying, well, when did we see you and do this? And he said, whatever you did to the least of these, and we'll talk about that language of the least of these, you did to me. And this group gives this exegesis of that text. We hear with sober conviction Jesus declaring that a church which fails to serve with and for the poor does not know him. We agree with Pope Francis, who stated that a church that is not actively supporting and serving the needs of the poor has no right to call itself a church at all, and should be prepared to give up its tax-exempt status to operate as a church. Let us be counted among the sheep who met their king as a stranger. And so when we look at that last section of Matthew 25, Jesus names the hungry. So when we're thinking about our own role in alleviating hunger, that has to include access to land. It has to include access to fresh food, nutritive food. It has to look at how the environment is being impacted in ways that affect the food supply. Treatment of the thirsty includes access to clean water. Look at what's happening to our siblings in Texas right now. Infrastructure has everything to do with being thirsty, literally. Treatment of the stranger. How are we treating new arrivals, both when they arrive in our community and before they even get here? What advocacy role does the church have to play in our immigration policy? Treatment of the naked. Naked really meaning vulnerability. Who is left out there unprotected, unshielded? treatment of the sick, access to healthcare. We've seen in this last year that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown people. In fact, the recent news stories named that life expectancy for all Americans on average have been reduced by 1 year, but for Black folks, it had been reduced by 3 years. And so again, the COVID-19 pandemic did not create that disparity in health outcomes. It just exacerbated and magnified it. It just showed us full on what was already happening. And treatment of the prisoners. So we talked about the school to prison pipeline. What is our system of criminalization disproportionately doing to certain communities, and why? Are there other models of justice, restorative justice, transformational justice that might actually create more humane conditions for the entire community? Are we imprisoning people in ways that simply line the pockets of others? And in that manner, when we do that, we are actually re-chattelizing people. We're recreating and really reifying the systems of slavery. And so I want to last, before we go into a time of discussion here, talk about what Jesus means by the least of these. Now, all throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus uses what is known as diminutive language for people whom he loves, his disciples mainly. He refers to them as hoi mikroi, my little ones. An example of that would be you calling someone who's dear to you my baby. That's my baby. That's my little baby right there. They might be a grown person. They might be a big person, but for you, they are your little baby. That is the context in which Jesus uses the language of smallness, of littleness. And what he is saying in Matthew 25:40, when he talks about the least of these, he is using the superlative of that diminutive language. So the littlest of these. So whenever you read that, I want you to challenge yourself to translate it a different way in your head. When you see the least of my sisters and brothers, the least of my siblings, change it to the dearest of my siblings. And so for him, those who are dearest to him are those who are vulnerable, those who are hungry, those who are thirsty, those who are naked, those who are imprisoned, those who are just left out on the limb and cut off from the rest of the world, the rest of their siblings. He calls them his siblings, and not only his siblings, but his dearest siblings. And so when we think about that, church, it bears the question, and I'm going to stop sharing right now. It should bring up for us the fact that when we are looking for proximation to God, for closeness with God, we will find that among those who have been forgotten. Going back to Matthew 19, when Jesus is talking to his to this young man who comes to him saying, "What must I do to be saved?" Jesus is giving him a way to go to the people whom Jesus is most close to, the poor. He's offering him a way to be in greater relationship with them, those who have been intentionally left out of society. Go to them, sell your stuff and give it to them. Follow me, because I'm going to be with them. He's giving him an opportunity to widen his community and become people to other people. You know, y'all are from the South. We some of us refer to our family as our people. You, my peoples. These are my kin. These are my peoples. He's inviting kinship. He's inviting him to enter into a deeper kinship. And so, as we, I really want to open it for discussion, because we can talk. I can talk at you all day, but I want to hear from you what some of your reactions are as you hear this. What stirs up for you? What's curious for you?
If you have questions or comments, please raise your hand so that I can recognize you, and we can make it possible for you to ask Denise what you have to ask or comment in a way that you need to.
Do you want me to recognize, or do you want to recognize, Mr. Moderator?
Um,
Oh, I see the hand went down.
I'll do that if I see any hands. Frank had his hand up a minute ago, but I think he took it. No, there we are. Carnell Hampton has a question. And Frank Coakley's hand is back up.
Carnell, if you can, unmute yourself if you do have a question or comment. Or maybe we'll just move on to Frank.
No, I'm ready.
Oh, okay. Go for it, Carnell.
Denise, I commend you on your presentation. It was wonderful. But the question I have, how can the church really deals with racism and injustice in our society when the church fails to deal with it, to be the repairer and to deal with it according to the head of the church, Jesus Christ? So how can the church deal with it when they really want to admit that there is racism and injustice in our society? I won't talk about it.
Well, the answer to that would be not very well, right? Or at least not very effectively. And one of the tools that I constantly bring up for Presbyterians specifically is our own liturgy and our own spiritual life. Every time we get together in church, well, most Presbyterian churches, there's a prayer of confession. And why would we bother confessing if we couldn't trust that God would forgive and send us on to do better? So much of what we run into, and we have to name that the Presbyterian Church USA is a 90-ish% white denomination. It is a hard reality to consider that this church has had a role to play in what we are, and has a role to play in what we are seeing in terms of racial inequity in the United States. And so I really invite the church to lean into its, do we trust God? Do we trust, I mean, it's a simple question. Do we trust God? Do we trust in God's grace? Do we trust in God's salvation? Do we trust God's process of sanctification? This really is what it is. And so I don't want us to be like that rich young man who walks away from a more whole vision, sad because it means that we would have to give up something that's familiar to us or do something that might really be difficult. Because if we trust God, then we can go into difficult tasks, trusting that God is going to be with us. That's a short answer. Like, we can't do it, not until we do that.
Well, thank you.
I see two other hands up. Frank Coakley.
Yeah. Yes, Denise, thank you so much for your presentation. Piggybacking on Reverend Hampton, how do we trouble the waters in our congregations to raise the consciousness that racism is in the church, when so many in the church are of the opinion that all is well? They're in calm waters and they want to stay in calm waters and not troubled waters.
Yeah. So what's different from someone like me who does this work in faith spaces and someone who's outside of that faith framework is that I'm very cognizant of the role that powers and principalities are playing in that intransigence and that reluctance to even respond to troubled waters, right? And so we need to understand that we're not greater than our master. Jesus told his disciples he shot from the hip and said, listen, you're going to go through some things. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart because I have overcome the world. And so the life of Christianity, and this is what I find myself impressing constantly, is not a life of promised comfort. That's dominance that promises comfort. Notice the difference too, as we enter into this Lenten season, of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. And one of the promises that the devil makes to Jesus in this temptation is everything in this world is going to be given to you if you just follow me. If you would just worship me. That's the language that the tempter uses, worship me. Anytime Jesus wanted to add to his fold, he told people to follow me. That meant follow me even to the cross. And so much of what we find ourselves having to do in 2021 is disentangle our theology and our life from promises of comfort. Now, there's a difference between being comforted and being comfortable. Jesus told us to take heart because things were going to get hard, but that didn't mean that God wasn't still with us. Comfortableness really is the whole world being given to you, which looks more like the vision that Jesus cast, which looks more like the promises that we see in scripture, or the account that God offers us. And so that means not being afraid that somebody's going to take their membership and their donations with them. It might mean that we have to die to ourselves, that we have to dwindle in our numbers and in our donations. That's a scary thought. But on the other side of death is resurrection. At least that's what I read in the Bible. So who are we really afraid of? Are we afraid of God or humans? That's a question we have to constantly ask ourselves every day. And we got to pray. We have to rely on our spiritual disciplines, because there's so much of this that we can't do. We can only do what we can do. It's really up to God to give the harvest, and God to send us to who will receive what we have to say. And just like he told the 70 that he sent out, if they're not going to receive you, move on.
Yeah. Okay, I think Johnny Dennis had his hand up next.
Thank you, Rhett. And Denise, I appreciate your conversation. I will tell you that not that we always succeed at it, but my wife and I use Matthew 25 as our guiding reason for being involved with the church and what we do. If you got a question, you just kind of go there, and it pretty much answers that question. Concerning where we are right now, with two things in particular, with the environmental and systemic racism, and having listened to the news last night about the systemic racism, especially in the Army, the police departments, and the other things that's happening, and that we're discovering, for some reason, we're just now discovering this. You made a comment that said it's not about our intentions, but it's about our impact. It seems to me like in both the environmental and the systemic racism, that was intentional, that it was done intentionally. We knew what we were doing when we did that. We pretty much got the outcomes that we expected, and continue to try to use those intentions to, I don't know a good word for it, except say to rule the nation. So I was just a little confused by that, because it is about our intentions, I would think. And you said it was not about the intentions, but the impact. So could you speak to that for just a minute? Explain that to me.
Yeah, so when I said that, I was talking in conjunction with the understanding of implicit bias. And so when we're talking about what our own expressed beliefs are versus what our implicit associations and our implicit biases are, what makes it hard for us to understand or receive the message that we are culpable and complicit in the proliferation of racism. What makes that hard for us to understand is that we believe that we are good people and that we mean well. So yes, there is intentional, malicious, willful racism at work in the world. And there is also, but that racism does not find success without the cooperation of good people who refuse to examine our own complicity and culpability. So that's what I mean by it's not about your intent, particularly those of you who have good intentions. It is about your impact. What fruit are you bearing? And I hope that clears it up.
Okay, thank you. I want to let everybody know we've got just about 12 minutes left and several folks that have questions. So I want to get to them. Please keep your questions as brief as possible so that our guest has an opportunity to answer them. I think Krista Brewer was up next. Nope, she's now a co-host. Ella Busby. Ella, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Denise. Thanks for your powerful message and your presentation. For me, James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced is changed, but nothing is changed if not faced. Can you give us some steps on how we can begin the difficult, tough talk, how to have the conversation about racism and to try to make a difference? What are some steps that we can use to have that difficult conversation with others?
Yeah, I don't know if I can give you steps because so much of this is relational, and so much of how we even begin has to do with our relationships. What I can say is what seems to be effective for, I know myself and for many others, is to talk about the impact to our own lives and our own experiences. Because one thing you can't take away from me is my experiences and my memories, and I claim them. And however they make you feel is your business, but I have to talk about what I have experienced and what I have witnessed. That really is, my phone wants to talk to me, stop it. That really is how the gospel was spread, right? It wasn't, the apologists didn't come until later. Systematic theology didn't come until later. The gospel was initially spread by eyewitness accounts and by people who had these revelatory experiences with Jesus Christ. And so much of this, we overcome by our testimony. So much of this is going to have to be rooted in our testimony. I can tell you what brings me to this work is the fact that Jesus called me to a denomination where 9 out of 10 of the people don't look like me. Probably more than that don't look like me. And I'm asking God, well, why? And I feel like the Holy Spirit said, because you have to tell your story and you have to make space for yourself and stand in your own truth. I mean, and for those of us who are not racialized as white, that's often where we, that is our lot in this space. And for my siblings who are racialized as white, have to do something along the same lines. Like, when did you come into the realization that this was an issue and said, you know what, I used to think that, how you're thinking, but you know what I later learned is this, right? And so I think that has a powerful way of tilling the soil for whatever gets planted after that. I love this Baldwin quote that you that you mentioned, I'm guided by it. Something that's also attributed to Maya Angelou, but I don't think, or she might have gotten it from someone else. And I'm paraphrasing. It says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yes.
Right. And so the Bible reminds us that we can do a whole lot of really impressive things, but if we don't do them with love, they're for nothing. And it's not hokey sentimentality that I approach this work from love. I do. And if we don't love people, if we're just looking to bash people over the head, this won't work. Not from a church perspective, not from a faith perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Diana Scroggins, your hand is up. Diana? Then let's move on to John Brearley. Unmute yourself and offer your question.
Thank you, Rhett. Wanted to thank Pastor Denise for those challenging words. We need to be challenged all the time. I just want to share the perspective that while we're not necessarily doing it well, there are many of my colleagues and many people in the community where I live who have jumped headfirst into this conversation. And the thing that I've learned is that it's now easier to talk about it than it is to be quiet. And the next step for us, and we are, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of Presbyterians of color in my community, and that is a deficit that I grieve greatly. But there are many people of faith who go across all races, and we are getting together and we are having honest conversation. We don't know what that means, but we're now to the point where we really want to take honest actions together, even if they're wrong, and to do it in the right spirit. And Frank, my dear colleague, Frank, I just want to suggest that we don't have to churn the waters. The waters are already spinning out of control. And what we need to do is wade in the water.
Amen.
and get in there together and just trust the Spirit to lead. And I feel more passionately about that than I have at any point in my ministry. And it's always been a focus, but now it's a compelling conviction that the time has come. The movement is here. Let's do it together.
Amen.
Thank you, John. Diane, are you back with us yet with a question? If so, unmute yourself.
I hope I am. Am I unmuted now?
You're fine now.
Reverend Anderson, I just appreciate the words that have come from you and your talk and I just live in adoration. I just wanted to say that along with Reverend Beardley, I think what we need is dialogue. We need everybody to get together and just talk. My minister, Reverend Larson, is in Union Seminary, and one project that they did for the D-men is to have dialogue. And they got 8 or 9 of us in churches to just sit and talk about bias, about things we grew up with, how to solve them, what to do next. And I think the dialogue is so important, and I'd like to see more of it. Thank you.
Amen. It's powerful. And we do it in balance with action, right? Like we don't act without our people and knowing what our people need and want from us. And we can't just sit around and talk either. Like we balance the two, but that relational component is so important, especially within the church. And that's what dialogue engenders.
Yep.
I thank you for that point.
Thank you. I think Steve Fitzgerald has his hand up. Steve, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, she just kind of stole my thunder. I was going to say the same thing about dialogue. Denise, thank you so much for talking with us. I won't say talking to us because I know that was a passion of yours that you have been talking with us. I just want to, and John and Nick, and there's so many others in our presbytery that are seriously doing things to try to create dialogue, but we're not meeting together across racial barriers. We still have so much work to do, and that's a first is, and of course this past year has been horrible. It's been a real challenge with what's going on in our country. And yet, because of the pandemic, we've met together less frequently, rather almost not at all. But if we're not talking together, you know, I did back in the 90s interfaith stuff where Jews and Muslims and Christians got together just for prayer. So the racial bias is also religious bias. And I think my challenge is the presbytery needs to give some direct actions to churches to help make this happen, which help sessions discuss it and come to the conclusion rather than the pastors or teaching elders pushing it. But that the sessions would hear a challenge from the presbytery with specific plans to create more dialogue, more listening opportunities so that we can build greater friendships and hear more stories. Stories change lives. And that's all I had to say about that.
I think you raised some good points, Steve, and for Presbyterian leadership, hearing you like pray about that and take that into consideration. I will say a couple of things. Presbyterians really like stepped plans, like we like to be instructed, because, you know, it's a good entree into work that that probably befuddles us and we just don't know what to do. And I will say that so much of this work is just so caked over in years of history and patina and dirt and muck and grime that we're going to have to excavate for what really is our work, and you know, sometimes can't even wait for someone to give us a step into it. We have to really be in connection with the Spirit and unafraid to make any mistakes or missteps along the way, because so much of this work is so contextual. What would probably work in South Carolina may or may not work in Washington State, for instance, right? And so because so much of that work is contextual, it you know, maybe steps aren't the way they may be, or you know, I would consider, you know, what really is the barrier, what's stopping you, and what help do we need from the Holy Spirit to chip away at that. As for dialoguing together, I would agree that would take us a whole lot of the way. I also think that we need to understand the milieu in which we find ourselves. And I can speak, I don't like speaking for Black folks. I'm not Black. I don't know all of us. I wasn't at the last couple of meetings when we all decided what we believe. But I can say that Black folks are tired. And if it bears out that it's just hard to have those intercommunal dialogues, it's for a reason. And I will say too, that people of color have been trying to be integrated into white dominant society for generations. Like, we move into neighborhoods with you, you move out, or you create covenants that ensure that we can't move in the first place. We try to go to school with you, you spit on us, or you move your kids out into private schools. And so we have at this point a history of generations of trying to be integrated and have been turned away at so many terms. Like, what more should we have done? And so I say that to say that this is the history into which people are stepping when now in 2021 or sometime around this, they're trying to enter into this work. You're finding maybe some reticence from people of color who are just tired of being hurt and tired of being vulnerable. And so some work, not all of the work, but a good portion of the work is going to mean white people are talking to white people. White people are talking amongst themselves. Again, not all of the work, but just understand that this moment comes on the heels of so much fatigue and exhaustion and injury. And so it might even take, this is the parallel that I use. If I pour red wine onto my carpet today, like if I grab a bottle of white wine and put it on there, if I grab some Resolve, I can clean up that mess really quickly. It's going to take a longer time than it did to make the mess, but I can still clean it up fairly quickly. But what if a stain is set in for 400 years? And that's what it then becomes in the baseboards, right? It's all up in the padding of the carpet. And that's where we are in America. This is a set in stain. And grabbing a bottle of Resolve might do something, but we might need to tear up some stuff, and that's just going to be hard.
Thank you, Denise. We're on time to move to our next segment of our meeting, to the report of the stated clerk. But I think Denise, you've expressed a willingness to be around at the end of the meeting in case there were other questions. Is that correct? Okay, then there'll be some who I'm sure will be looking for you at that time. But with your permission and with Thanksgiving for not only your message but your response to the questions that have been raised. I'll move on to the report of the stated clerk.
Mr. Moderator, if I may, but just before you do that, I also want to express my thanks to Reverend Anderson. Absolutely. And it's great to have you. I know we've been talking about this and planning this, a number of us, for a long time. So we're really grateful, and it has not disappointed at all. It's been everything we wanted. I